All right, if everybody's ready, we'll go ahead and get started. So, the title of today's talk is Climate Change, Maladaptation, and Mitigation to Post-Disasters. So we've got a great panel, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. My name is Bo Jones. I'm an environmental and coastal lawyer here in town. I'm just serving as the moderator. The stars of the show are Dr. Shirley Laska, Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, Dr. Chris Peterson, and David Mew. They're going to be talking to you about this. I'll try and fill in some legalese if there's any that pops up. But otherwise, I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I could read a bio, but that's less time that you get to hear from them. So we'll let them go.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me without the mic?
It would be better.
Better with the mic. Okay. All right. Of course, you have to do this to get to the mic, but. All right. Well, thank you for having me. I am a very loyal, regular attender to this conference. I am not a lawyer, and therefore it's even better that I come because I have no motives other than to know how the good quality of the presentations and the food for thought that we have here. Just wonderful. And I also congratulate the students because they do it all, and they do it wonderfully. And that's the way that they're going to learn how to be a full-fledged professional. So congratulations to the students as well. Okay, I never present a presentation a second time. And that's probably pretty stupid in terms of the amount of time it takes me to put together each of my presentations. But I find that it's a mulling process that enables me to think about something I haven't thought about for a while. And I go around my daily activities mulling and thinking and positioning concepts and so on. And then finally I sit down and I put a PowerPoint together, trying to limit the words. Well, this time I think it worked well, but the problem is that the first half of the presentation is too long to get to the new idea, which is the second half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you what I hate to watch myself on the screen is I'm going to whiz through the front part. And if you want to know about the history and you want to know why we're in the mess that we are with regard to mitigation for extreme weather and sea level rise, then talk with me afterwards, or I'll give you a private showing of those slides, okay? But I think I have an idea here, and I'd like to try it out on all y'all. Been here for 52 years, so I guess I can say that, and see what your reaction is. So I hope you're looking at this map on the screen, and I'm hoping you're looking at where those two red arrows are. I'm surprised you haven't gasped by the number. 2080, expected decline in population in this area, 500,000 people. Similar for Miami. This is Science. It was published in Science. It's a Berkeley professor. I emailed back and forth with him. I did ask him how he created that number, and there was silence yesterday, but I'm going to find out the exact compilation of that number. Let's be serious. The sea level rise changes that the coastal protection folks have now presented for us tells us that maybe this is not far off, the 500,000 in 2080. So what I wanted to talk about was how way back when I started my work on flooding, which was the 1983 inland flood. We talk about the 1995, but there was one before that, the 1983. I did some research which I found very interesting, and I was very excited that people were responding to their risk. And I did systematic data, I did surveys, statistical analysis, and whoopee, I was off on my career on this topic. I had done gentrification before that. And also at that time, Clinton appointed James Lee Witt in something called the Project Impact, which was a way of engaging communities to make their own decisions about how they would address the risk that they had with regard to hurricanes and flooding and so on. Well, that was the dream time. After that, from 2000 to 2017, of course, we had Katrina. We had unqualified management of FEMA. You know, get a life, Brownie, you know. And we also had a restoration of qualified leadership after that, but unfortunately, it was broken, really broken. And then we had all the huge storms last summer. as the newspaper headlines tell us, it was the most costly disaster year on record. So I have concluded, and I will be more than happy to give you all the detail you'd like, that we are in a mess with regard to federal programs. I'm not going to address the state level. It's a little complicated, and recently I haven't had time to really assess that. But let's just talk about what I do know something about, and that is the federal and then also the local. Can't manage the magnitude. The delays of getting funding are horrendous. As you know, we can't fund the recovery of the 2016 floods because, oops, along come some other storms, and whoops, we have to negotiate it all over again. And whoops, we don't have a budget. And it just goes on and on. Thought we were going to get a reversal of the SBA loan duplication issue, where if you get a loan from FEMA, you can't do SBA without, having to pay back the loan. All the other countries, all the other locations in the U.S. that had the floods in 17 got it, and we didn't get it. So we're still stuck in that situation. And then the flood insurance is just a total mess. They've got to pass it soon. They can't figure out what they want. They don't know how to do it, and the flood maps are likewise. So bear with me. I think you can accept that there's a lot of arguments. I've been on National Academy of Science committees on this topic over the years. This one is on flood insurance. FEMA says, study it, but don't give us one recommendation. Just give us the data. We do that for 2 volumes. It's a lot of meetings, a lot of talk, a lot of data. And then they say, in public, well, the committee didn't give us a recommendation. It's sort of like General Honorary's comments, You say what is, how can I say it, useful for that particular situation in the politics. So the other challenge we face is all y'all and me, and that is people. People somehow resist dealing well with flooding. So much so that an economist at the Wharton School, Howard Kunruther, he's like 80, and he's been at this for decades and is internationally famous, just got so frustrated because he couldn't figure out how to convince us to take the right action. So here's what he set up. And it's fun to look at, but it's also sadly true. Myopia, amnesia about the problem, optimism about the problem, inertia about the problem, simplification, and hurting. He sees them all, and that we have to address them. So what I think is a solution is, number one, we take over our own lives here. We run resilience here. We don't let FEMA come in and give us these programs and tell us how to do it. Same thing General Honoré just said. Who's going to benefit from that? The large companies that do the restoration, the large companies that do the building. We have to become more aware of how to use the resources that are available to us, okay? And we, all y'all and me, have to be paying more attention to the role that we play and to the challenges of lower income residents to not be able to play the role that they would like to play because of their income. So here's an example of the ways in which taking action can help. This is one, by the way, that the state refuses to pass in Louisiana. We have no free board on the international code. Voted, 2 months ago, they just said, no, we're not going to do this. Everybody can make up their own mind. So if you see on the left, there's how much it costs to actually elevate a house, and then on the right is how much you save in flood insurance by virtue of elevating. And there's just no argument. It just works. But not here in Louisiana. We're one of the most flood-prone places in the country, and we do not have a requirement for an extra foot or 2 or 3 feet. Here's part of the same brochure in terms of comparison of flood insurance, but again, I don't have the time to get into the details. FEMA has also released reports talking about how mitigation saves. And by the way, we use mitigation in flooding to improvements to really be equivalent to adaptation. I know in climate change, mitigation is fossil emissions and so on, and fossil fuels. But in this case, we can't change it. We've just been saying that word too long. For every dollar spent on mitigation, $4 are saved. It's just a flat number, and that studies have repeatedly indicated it. So here we are. We're in a fix. We're in a mess. And so, as I said, I think we have to take local informed control of risk-reducing efforts. Now, this one just came out recently. One of my former students, Miriam Blabledia, wrote this column for Lens, and she says the sooner we define and adopt a thoughtful, equitable flood reduction fee, the better. She's right, but how do we do that? By engaging the public in conversations and understanding why we need it. That's missing from her quote. She's just got part of it here, she and Colleen. So here's what I'm going to propose. You know the state of the coast. Well, we need one for here. And I'm going to propose at the end the name of it, but I'm going to make the argument that we have so many organizations, and I have 30 of them here. I'm just going to flip them. And you all know more. I just learned one from Pat Bryant that we want to add to it, for example. And the idea is wonderful John Lopez's that he came up with when he was in the Corps of Engineers. You know how long ago that was? He's been out of there for a long time. And the idea is multiple lines. It's just the fact that there's a complex way to address this problem. And each one of these organizations can bring something to the table that will enable us to really get our teeth into a future for the city. So I'll just spin them. Here's the government ones. You've got the Homeland Security Emergency Preparedness. You've got the evacuees. You have the Office of Resiliency and Sustainability that came out of the competition for the funding from HUD. You have the permits and licenses. That's the ones who handle the flood insurance requirements. Very important. They need more staff. They need to do more outreach. The two flood authorities, the East and the West, they've got lots of potential for doing more. They should have public meetings. They should encourage people to come to their meetings. They should imagine how they can help people learn about what they do. And then we can monitor them better. We have to keep an eye on the public agencies as we do our own work. We have LaSafe that comes out of the same HUD competition, LA Safe. And this is a series of interviews in these 6 parishes looking at what these parishes want to do with regard to mitigation. Universities, activities. The center that I founded and has been led by Monica Ferris for the last 9 years. We divided the 18 years, and she's the last 9 as I've moved into the private nonprofit sector. They run groupings of community rating system communities where they can talk among themselves and learn how to improve their attempts to reduce their flood insurance. La House, been going on for quite some time. LSU Ag, excellent work on how to create sustainable houses. New one we're proud of. Chris and I, the Lowlander, have been working with the universities. I thought of this because we need to have organizations that are all around the state now that we have flooding all around the state. And this group of schools have just taken to it. It's exciting. And as you can see, all the architecture schools are here, as well as LSU Landscape, as well as the planning program at UNO and the Lowlander as a support. And how about foundations? Foundation for Louisiana just did the project with LA Safe and is also one of the recipients of the money from Rockefeller to do the climate change conference. We have the Moreau Foundation, always willing, always open to having us meet there and supportive of the things that we do. We have the Greater New Orleans Foundation, which again contributes and participates. Okay, professional organizations. We have the Floodplain Management Association. We have the American Institute of Architecture. We have GNO Inc. They're leading a national flood insurance initiative. They've got hundreds of people involved in theirs. Nonprofits with community resilience. NOLA Water from the Water Collaborative, very important. Housing NOLA. I talked to Andronika Morris, and she said yes, for sure, that they would be interested. Here's our Lowlander Center. And then we have National Hazard Mitigation Association, which was founded by one of our UNO graduates. Couldn't be better to have a national organization founded by one of ours. We have the Vietnamese American Young Leaders Association. They again would be perfect to participate. Urban Conservancy, excellent organization. They, with a group of us, got the debates on the mayoral candidates on flooding. and environmental nonprofits. We have the Delta chapter of the Sierra Club, Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. We have the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, Beverly Wright. We have the National Wildlife Foundation, which we have a representative. Where is he? Over here, David. And EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, and Gulf Restoration Network, Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation. So you see, we've got all this power to make a difference, to put this all together. Conference every year, just like the State of the Coast, but I do it every 2 years. And to, oh, I'm sorry, I got one more example. This is happening right now. This is in Monroe. This is being done by a man whose name is Tom Malmay, who does maps for FEMA. He is paying for this himself, and he is leading it. And it's called the Resilient Neighbors Fund. Block parties and assistance for jobs and job training, because he recognizes the two, safety and income, are critical. So an individual citizen is doing it. I mean, if he can do it, we can do a better job. So here's the title I want to propose that we do every single year. We have a conference, and we start fleshing in the ideas of how to improve our capacity to have a future. We're there. We just are there. This is not an alarmist. We are there, and we need to bring everyone together on a regular basis and up the ante and up the capacity. Thank you very much.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Muth. I work for the National Wildlife Federation, and I work for a group of organizations, most of which Shirley just mentioned, that work on delta restoration here in coastal Louisiana. I also work throughout the Gulf with NWF employees in the other Gulf states, but headquartered here. I'm from New Orleans, went to the University of New Orleans, and I'm going to move rapidly through my 200 slides. I think we can get through that in 15 minutes. But I'm here because Shirley saw a presentation that I had done for a meeting sponsored by the City of New Orleans. And she saw a connection between what she hoped to get out of this panel and what I had been talking about. And what I'm going to kind of look at here is to kind of put this in historical perspective. Why are we here? How did we get here? Why are we in the situation we're in? I think a lot of our problem, any human problem, is that we see the world we're in as the only possible world. It's natural to do that. No one is questioning why the Corps of Engineers is opening the Bonnet-Carré spillway and sending water out into the Gulf via Lake Pontchartrain. Obviously, they have to do that. That's the way the system's designed, and we need to save the city of New Orleans from the flood. But the design of that system is based upon ideas from the 20s and 30s and actually from decades before that. And it couldn't be a worse, you couldn't come up with a worse design. It's the shortest route to the Gulf between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It bypasses all of the wetlands that need what is now pouring through there. And it upsets an estuarine system that doesn't need to be upset by that. So I'm going to do a little very quick history, and some of it's pretty elementary. And I'm not going to dwell on it. I've got a lot of pretty pictures and maps up there. But I'm building the background as to why I think we got to where we are today. And I want to go back and remind people that a lot of what we think are modern innovations, the levee system, we always talk, the Corps built the levee system. Actually, the French built the levee system. The first landowners built the levee system. And by 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, there were levees from Head of Passes to Baton Rouge on both banks of the river. So over 200 years ago. So we've been tinkering with this system for 200 years or more. 300 years when you go back to the city of New Orleans. And if you look at the history of the city of New Orleans, founded 300 years ago, chose a high spot on the Mississippi River, immediately were flooded out first by the Mississippi River, so they built levees, and then 2 years later by the first hurricane flooding to hit the city. So we began, our ancestors here in this city began coming up with solutions. It took forever, and there were lots of floods, lots of problems. But the system that we came up with was to build those levees along the Mississippi River to prevent the spring flood from spreading out. And luckily for the Delta, luckily for the ecosystem that supports us all, they were lousy levees. And they broke all the time. And when they broke, spectacular amounts of water and sediment would flow for weeks, months, sometimes years into the Delta and make up for the fact that we had cut off the spring flood and we had cut off the distributaries. But we had other flooding problems before the 1927 flood. We went through a period of well over 100 years of arguing about how we should treat the river and how we should tame the river or not tame the river and what we ought to do. And there's ample historical evidence, and there's some great recent books written about how that argument was resolved. But you can go back and hear people saying, if we cut off the system, if we don't let sediment out into the Delta's going to disappear. But it's okay. They'll figure it out. They'll figure it out in 2 or 3 generations. Well, we're there. We're at the point where the Delta is disappearing. And we have a system that was built to deal with what happened in the past. And whatever forward-thinking elements there were to that system, what they didn't anticipate was climate change and what is now coming. The feat of sea level rise that we're going to face over the next century or centuries, depending on what we do. And we know how it turned out for us, of course. We cut off not only the spring flood, but we cut off all the distributary channels, all the forks in the lower river that sent water all over the place and sent sediment all over the place. And even where we finally let the river almost run free down in the Bird's Foot, because of the requirements of navigation, because we need that deep channel for big ships to come in out of the Gulf, we don't even let that work. Most of the sediment is wasted and goes out into the Gulf, where it can't build land, where it can't sustain land. So we know the statistics. We've lost 2,000 square miles of coastal wetlands since the 1930s. And we're going to lose a minimum of about 2,000 more square miles over the next 50 to 75 years, maybe twice that, if we don't radically change the system. And just to kind of bring it home to the city of New Orleans, it's not just the river flooding, it's not just, it's rainfall flooding. Those of you living in New Orleans just experienced it last summer. There are all kinds of ways that we could have expanded off of the natural levee into the wetlands surrounding the city. We chose to engineer our way out of it, to build a perimeter levee system, to build a network of canals and massive pumps, to burn energy to move the water out of the system. But that isn't the only way we could have done it. Venice didn't do it that way. Communities in Florida don't do it that way. New Orleans chose to do it that way, and the consequence was that much of the city, all of the city sank, but much of the city sank below sea level and is continuing to sink below sea level, so that when you get a failure, when the levees break, it's not just a one-day flood or a two-day flood. It's weeks, months until you can repair the levees, pump the water out. In the meantime, you have massive destruction within the levee system. We use some of these techniques. For instance, the whole lakefront, Lake Vista, Lake Oaks, all those places are fill, right? They're pumped out of the lake behind a massive concrete seawall. That was the levee for decades. That was the highest point between us and the lake. It worked. Worked better than Lakeview right behind it, which is 10 feet below sea level. So we had some choices. And we know how the choices that we made worked out. Hurricane Katrina, rainfall flooding, et cetera, et cetera. We could spend a lot of time going over all of the things that are pictured in these photographs and maps and so forth. Suffice to say that we are paying the price for decisions that we made, in many cases a century ago, in some cases 2 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago. We're now facing climate change. We're now facing a really radically different future. Because we're on a sinking delta, we are the place in the world, where the first world, where the industrial world, is going to deal with the worst implications of relative sea level rise. This is it. And so how we handle it, how we think about it, how we deal with it, is going to be incredibly important, in my opinion. And I think if we don't know what we did wrong in the past, we're not going to be able to think very clearly about how we move forward. As Dr. Laska showed you, we haven't been very good at this, but it's going to get a lot worse. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We do have a response in the state of Louisiana, the master plan, and it's not quite as bleak. There's a little green there, but there's still a lot of red. No one is proposing that we can prevent most of that land loss. It's too late. We've already baked in the climate change. We've baked in the sea level rise. There isn't sufficient sediment. There isn't sufficient money to stop it. Now, of course, we're not alone. But again, as I said, because we're sinking, we're going to deal with it first. But we do have a weapon. We're watching once again as millions of tons of sediment are being wasted, going through the Bonnet Carré spillway out into Lake Pontchartrain, spewing out into the Gulf at the mouth of the river, into deep, deep water. So we have a way to deal with it, and that's to build controlled sediment diversions that mimic the way the Mississippi River built all of this land in the first place. But I would say that if we continue to think the way we have always thought, if we continue to think that the system that was built, that was designed by the Corps of Engineers in the late 1920s and 30s, is the right system for managing the river, not just for an ecological purpose, which is to build land to rebuild delta, but thinking about integrating everything we do inside the levee system, outside the levee system. A few years ago, one of our partners in the Mississippi River Delta Coalition, EDF, sponsored a design competition. It was called Changing Course. They had design firms, engineering firms from all over the world compete. I encourage you to go to Changing Course and look at some of these ideas. And they were asked, sort of a theoretical out there, 100 years from now, what would the delta look like? What would be possible? How could you sustain the delta? And all of them came up with something very similar to each other. A much smaller footprint maintained by utilizing the maximum amount of water and sediment available in the Mississippi River. To do that, you need to redesign the navigation system. It's the most, it's the largest navigation system by volume in the world. Is that, you've been signaling me this whole time and I haven't been, good. He's, I've been looking around. Where is he? Oh, there he is. But we have to have a navigation system. There's not much point in having a New Orleans, the fulcrum between the Mississippi River and the rest of the world, if we don't have a navigation system. But we have to design a new one if we want to maximize the use of sediment. But every one of these futures is a smaller delta. Now, interestingly, when the design competition was set up, we wanted to tiptoe a little bit. We didn't really want to start the conversation about communities moving, what the implications were. It seemed premature at that point. But since then, we've had LA Safe, we've had real conversations beginning, and we've had new sea level rise numbers. So that 100-year-off future looks awfully like it's going to be here in 40 or 50 years. So it's time for all of us to begin thinking about how you maintain anything at all in coastal Louisiana. These are just some of the ideas that a lot of very smart people, a lot of scientists, designers, planners, economists came up with, but there are a lot of other possibilities. But we need to start thinking about them and thinking about the implications of the mistakes that worked, frankly. They worked until they failed. Now, we could talk a lot about other problems that have come up as a result of that, like all the money that we owe on the hurricane system that now surrounds the city of New Orleans that we have no clue how we're going to pay. But we'll leave that for the discussion period. So I'm going to end it there and turn it over. Okay, thank you.
Oh, you sent it? You have it on a thumb drive or not?
I have it on computer.
Yeah, there's a. Can you show this thumb drive and transfer it over? Or, there's one right here, too. You want to see?
While he's getting this set up, I'm Christina Peterson, and my background has been for the last 35, 40 years doing a large-scale response to disasters and working in communities to help the communities decide, and I'm talking about not the government communities, but the people communities, decide their future, which was very different from the kind of future that they experienced during the disaster. A lot of disasters, as far as the impact to communities of color, are usually because of socially constructed vulnerabilities, be it redlining of housing, being a redlining of resources. But the social construct is something that could be dispelled in the recovery process if done properly. So my first introduction to Louisiana was after Hurricane Andrew, where I worked from Lafourche, Terrebonne Parish, all the way over to Lafayette area, which was part of the main area that was hit. And since then, I've had some on and off history with Louisiana, and then finally, after Isidore and Lily, I met Dr. Laska, and somehow she gave me some Kool-Aid, and I'm here ever since. And I love it. So I thank the people who organized this conference. It's just amazing. The students have been amazing, and the presentations have been amazing. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about, David had just given us this great presentation on what's going on with the Delta and what's going to happen. Shirley's given us this great presentation as far as the population shifts and what we possibly can do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the human adaptation aspect of it and some of the kinds of possibilities for the future. So my topic on this is resettlement, a chance for creative adaptation through rejuvenation and restoration. And had I been to the session that was just prior to this, I would have changed the name to Who is Developing What for Whom? That would have been the name. Because it comes down to who is developing what for whom and who has the right to say and talk for community and speak for community or plan for community. Whoops. Obviously not the one. So we know a little bit as far as just being here and hearing all the presentations. Everything is changing. It's a game changer. And usually the people who are at the low end of the scale as far as in the game change are those who have little political voice, those with little resources, but they can organize, as General Honore said, to a powerful voice. And so we're at a point in history where we need to look at not replicating what put us into this situation, but thinking about something very different for the future, so that we can live into a future that will have a future for our next generation, for our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. This is a view that you see many pictures like this if you ever see pictures of the coast of Louisiana. But this was once a very healthy, sustainable location. It could be anywhere along the coast of Louisiana. This one happens to be close to Port-au-Channes and Ile-de-Jean-Charles. But at one point, the people moved there because it was a high ridge. They had cattle. They had livestock of every kind. They had gardens. They had trees that produced nuts and fruit. Very, very sustainable, and a community that could feed itself and feed other communities around it. But yet, it wasn't through what they did that brought them to this situation. It was through choices that we made in development and other land usage, which David certainly pinpointed. We have, this is an old map. I can't use the new map because it's so cluttered you can't see where the Gulf is. But this is an old map of the oil wells and gas wells. And if we were to layer many of these different types of maps upon each other, we could then start seeing where the problems are for the coast and for moving inland and for doing adaptation measures. There are maps like this for storm surges, which is the next one here. There are ones for climate change where there's projection. Virginia Burkett has wonderful ones through the IPEC projecting droughts and where we can anticipate less agricultural activity. We have maps that we can overlay with issues of cancerous areas, of toxic areas, of areas of different kinds of land use that we may want to look at differently. And so the people who are in these communities that are, in the red, that are going to have to anticipate moving at some point, why not us being very intentional and very aware of what is out there as far as choices so that we can start looking at this in a very educated way with choices that will allow for healthy, sustainable communities. And doing so means putting together all the collective data and not replicating, putting people into harm's way. So pre-planning, I'm making a plug that pre-planning for rejuvenation that really leads to healthy restoration of land and also the community is vital to what we do. We cannot do the same old, same old. This is a plan that was done as an intentional community for a resettlement. And in this planning, it plans for a zero carbon footprint. Can you imagine if we all planned for a zero carbon footprint? Where you have renewable energy, you have waterways that cleanse themselves, you have the runoff from neighboring areas that are also cleansed so that you have pure water going back into bayous that are now extremely polluted. You have tree cover and flora and fauna that can support the migrating coast as it pushes in, because it cannot be just for humans, it has to be also for the adaptation of all the animals, birds, and others that move in as well. So if we start planning in intentional ways like this that can give us healthy communities, sustainable communities for the culture of the people and also for the well-being of our ecosystem. That's what we need to do. And some of the actions that I'm proposing that take us there, and Mr. Brownell was one who I'm going to quote now. His quote would be from this bottom one of democratic engagement and co-management. Otherwise, get rid of Exxon. Take Exxon out of government and put the people back into government. And we need to do that very, very intentionally and believe that the people in the communities have knowledge that can then address the different issues that they need to address and be part of it. Frederick Burkus, who is a biologist at the University of Winnipeg, has been in the forefront with this, with a person who was a Nobel laureate that passed away a couple years ago, Elinor Ostrom. And they formed what was called the International International Association for the Study of the Commons. They had worked very diligently to look at the co-management utilizing local knowledges of people and the management of their own resources and the protection of the resources. I think you heard in other presentations, especially from Mr. Cousteau last night, was that if you don't love a place, you're not going to protect a place. Local folks are going to love their place. That's what we have found along the coast of Louisiana. So include, obviously, the people need to be at the heart of it. The democratic engagement and co-management needs to be the first thing, and take Exxon out of it. Traditional local knowledges, local, indigenous, all types of knowledges need to be at the table. As Shirley was suggesting, getting everyone together to start talking about resiliency. We need to do that in that comprehensive, complex planning that this is going to take. Because we're going to have to think about thinking outside the box. We're going to have to push envelopes, just like people in the past have done when they've done intentional communities, which used to be called utopian communities. Well, we can't afford being pushed off on the side of being called utopian communities anymore, because our whole life support system is at stake with climate. So we need to start thinking outside the box and realize that it's our world that we're trying to protect. Being proactive, I'm going from the bottom up, being proactive and anticipatory, thinking about community land trust. One of the oldest land trusts in the country is the Albany Land Trust in Albany, Georgia. It was built because of the extreme prejudice and racism in Georgia. And yet it's one of the most amazing land trusts that there is. We need to start thinking in ways that puts us outside the box to protect the land so it cannot be gentrified after it becomes protected. If we have lands that are set aside in land trust that are then rejuvenated through the rejuvenation of the land, through the protection of water and air, soil, and so forth, then it becomes very valuable. And what's going to happen? But rich folks go, oh, wow, this is a good place to go. So we need to protect those in land trusts so that we can have those entrusted for the future, maybe call them climate change land trust, so that they can be entrusted for the future in that rejuvenation renewal process for communities to eventually move to them when needed. We need to learn from the environmental and social justice movements. They have a lot to offer us in understanding what we need to have included within the establishment of land trust or places in which we move, so that we're not moving beside a Norco or moving beside another problem. We need to look at the hazards literature, the hazards community, to be able to see the literature that has come out of more than, 80 years of hazards material. The Gilbert White that said that, we cannot be continuing to build in floodplains, and all the literature that has come since then. We need to learn from former models of intentional communities. Places like WPA had 100 communities built across the country during the Depression. If they can do it during the Depression, why can we not do it now? The other is that no community, absolutely no community that's in that floodplain that is forced to move should have to compete for funds to have a resettlement. That is unconscionable, it is unjust, it's unfair, period. And we should have set aside funds to be able to do that. Whether we do it in a similar way as the time of the WPA, where there was a resettlement, actually a resettlement organization act under the WPA that was short-lived, but it was there, and to have that under the federal government where you have an integrated system, very much like you have with FEMA, with all the different federal agencies working together in order to be able to then augment and support the efforts of the local community. We need to start thinking of systems that will then help in doing this so that there doesn't have to be competition between one community to the next. So that is it, and I would say thank you very, very much, and we'll entertain questions and answers, I'm sure, at the end. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about something a little different in that it is not Louisiana, but you will find, I think, some similarities. And before I get started, first of all, I'd like to thank the Tulane Law students for putting this together. It's phenomenal. We have a similar kind of coastal policy clinic in the College of William and Mary. It's a much smaller group, I think, but maybe this could be, they do an annual summit, but it isn't necessarily all put on by the students. But anyhow, they can learn a few lessons from you. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists and Bo for jumping in as the moderator at the last minute. We lost our moderator, and we didn't really collaborate until maybe a week or so ago. But they've all given such tremendous presentations to you this afternoon. I hope to be able to pull a little bit of that and tell you a little bit about climate impact on national security, and using the example of the Hampton Roads region where I live as kind of an example of the challenges that we're facing, some of which are very similar to what you're facing, some of which are very different. I came to this after retiring from a 31-year career in the Navy, driving ships. If I look a little familiar to some of you, it's because I did the 1812 kickoff here in April of 2012 for the Secretary of the Navy, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the war, 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. And ran around for 2 weeks wearing summer whites and wasn't allowed to wear anything else, and knew we'd achieved saturation of the market when I walked into the ladies' room in the Hilton and someone said, "I've seen you on TV." So yes, but a lot of ships came in, a lot of tall ships and Navy ships, and they hadn't been in for a while, so it was a big deal for the city. They had a huge hotel occupancy right there, extremely happy, and the weather was great, so a good time was had by all. But so I love Louisiana, I love New Orleans. I also built a ship, reconned a ship in Pascagoula, Mississippi, so spent a lot of time here during that adventure too, and that was just before Katrina, and there were all kinds of conversations about what was going to happen here when the big one came and how vulnerable the city was, and then of course it all came true in the most tragic of ways. And I found myself in a NATO command in Lisbon, Portugal, doing an airlift to send aid to my own country, to you all. I'm not sure that we sent you things you wanted because wool blankets seem to be quite a popular thing with the European countries, but they did what they could, and we hope at least a small amount of it reached you and was of some value. So Hampton Roads, Virginia. I worked on a pilot project there for 2 years, 2014 to 2016, looking at whole of government and community solutions to try to approach this. At the end of that pilot project, exactly nothing happened. I ran a working group, one of 5 working groups, and 4 advisory committees, and when nothing happened, based on the very good work that 200 regional professionals did, I got mad. And because I was retired, I could do what I wanted, and so I've kind of been on a crusade ever since then to try to take what we did and turn it into action. So there's a little bit of this in that. We are extremely vulnerable. As a region, our economy is very much based on federal presence. There's 29 separate federal entities represented there and hundreds of facilities. 2/3 of what's there is Department of Defense, 3/4 of that is Navy. That's about 40% of our GDP. Next, we have the 5th largest container port on the east coast of the United States. I know that doesn't impress you all with the tremendous port facilities you have in the state, but for us, it's big because what comes into there gets taken by Norfolk Southern all over the east coast of the United States, past the Mississippi. We're also the largest coal export point on the east coast of the United States. I know that comes with a boo hiss, but it is in fact true. It's a big part of the economy. 25% roughly of Norfolk Southern's income is from that, for good or ill, it's a fact. We also have a tremendous tourism industry, largely based on the Virginia Beach area. I don't personally see that as the most beautiful beachfront, if anybody's ever been there, but it does draw quite a bit of activity and a lot of dollars and income for the region, among other areas in the region. It has a huge historical background, obviously, and then waterfront property taxes. 2,900 square miles of territory in the Hampton Roads region, and we'll look at that here in a minute. About 825 miles of coastline, lots of beautiful waterfront property that looks just like this. This is actually part of a marsh restoration project in my neighborhood that I'm a part of, but lots of people live there because they want to have that view. It's not my view, but it's a beautiful view. So, and because we are a Dillon Rule state, and I don't know if Professor Davis is in the room, but during the course of the pilot project, we came down and talked with him, and he told us he used terminology that General Honore would use to discuss the Dillon Rule and whether or not it was a serious impact on cities and municipalities' ability to collaborate. But in the state of Virginia, even though it is not written into our state constitution, it is enforced in very strict terms so that none of the cities and municipalities in Hampton Roads can collaborate in any formal way unless it is specifically authorized by the state government. This is a tremendous impediment to progress, not only here, statewide, not only for climate and sea level rise, for anything. Healthcare, education, economic development, you name it, everybody's competing, and Virginia's wondering why it's not doing that well. That's why. So, we have challenges. We are also sinking. We're sinking from subsidence due to taking too much water out of the aquifer. We're sinking from tectonic plate movement. We're sinking because we're sitting on a pile of sand. So there are a lot of different factors in why we're sinking, and the subsidence is not consistent throughout the region. Some areas it's 40% of our problem, some areas it's no percent of our problem. But between us sinking and the waters rising, we are second only to you all in this area in the rate of change. So we've experienced 18 inches of sea level rise in the last 100 years. Now, the rest of the East Coast is catching up to us in that the rate of which they are experiencing sea level rise is the same or similar, but we're already ahead. So we have ourselves a problem. The last big storm that came through was Isabel, and so there's a couple pictures from Isabel. And the little car there swimming away with as its battery gets flooded out that is the wharf where everybody parks on Naval Station Norfolk. So the picture of the amphib there in the storm it's before it got that bad. So note to self, don't park your car on the pier. The picture at the bottom from 2013, it was taken by Skip Stiles, a man some of you may be familiar with. He runs a nonprofit called Wetlands Watch, which is a Virginia-based nonprofit looking at wetlands restoration and trying to ensure appropriate legislation to preserve our wetlands. But that could have been taken this weekend. That's the Welland Avenue. It's pretty near where I live. It floods many high tide cycles out of the year. Not all. We might go a whole month and not have that situation. But it is what we've started to see in the region is since the late 90s, we have more heavy rain events, more flooding above the nuisance flooding level, which is just over half a meter. It stays around longer, and we have higher levels of flooding. So all of those curves go like this from the late 90s on. I just read a paper this morning that talked about, I was curious what our 100-year storm level was. Right now, I would have guessed 7 to 8 inches. According to NOAA, it's technically 9.5, but since the year 2000, it's really closer to 11 inches. So our 100-year storm actual is about 11 inches of rain. We have a lot of neighborhoods that flood now routinely. In Norfolk of 2016, that was taken after Hurricane Matthew, which wasn't even a tropical storm by the time it got to us, hit in October. We had, in the previous 35 days, a 12-inch rain and a 10-inch rain, and Matthew dumped 13 inches. So we had water appearing in places that we had never had water before, which is starting to be a problem for the emergency managers. Every new big storm event is whack-a-mole. What's going to happen this time? So this is an example of a house in Larchmont on a crescent where most of the homes have been raised. And it's kind of interesting to look at it from a historical perspective because they're all different heights based on what FEMA recommended over the years. Some are 5 feet, some are 11 feet, some of them are now like 14 feet. There's a little ranch perched, he's at least 15 feet up. And so why are people doing this? These houses are not sellable. They're doing this because they can't sell them anyway, and they might as well live there as long as they can. But the challenge we're seeing in the region is, what are the other options? If Norfolk had bought all this out, they would have, I guarantee you, saved a lot of money if they started 20 years ago and started buying these houses out, just bought them all out. Nope, they didn't want to do it then. They didn't want to talk about it. So we see a lot of this, and we're starting to see more and more of it other places in the community. I'm going to make sure I'm not missing any points here, if you will excuse me. So back to my 29 separate facilities. Oops, I think I skipped one too many. Here we go. On your left is a map that is used by the Hampton Roads Military and Federal Facilities Alliance, commonly known as HRUMFA. You get to start everything with LA. We have to start everything with HR. So HRUMFA is an organization funded by, it's not very nice, is it? But that's what it is. That's what we call it. They're funded by the cities and, to some extent, the business community, prominently to keep the military from leaving Hampton Roads. So they're like the BRAC prevention organization. And they keep track of a lot of different things, and so this is a map that they use routinely along with the Planning District Commission to show where all the federal facilities are. The map on your right is an elevation map. It's not a flooding map. The buff color is the highest, that's upland, and then red fading to green is getting lower and lower and lower, and then the purple colors are wetlands. So if you look at what's on your left and you compare it with what's on the right, you can see that most of the federal facilities are in very low areas. So in the 17 cities and municipalities that are in there, just about everybody has something that they care about. And what's interesting about the region is people live in one city, but they work in another. So 65% of the region is in one, lives in one city, but drives to another. A colleague of mine was the commanding officer of Yorktown Naval Weapons Station, which is kind of up the peninsula there. And he used to joke that he had to go through 4 cities, 2 bridges, and a tunnel to get to work every day. Twice. That was there and back. So that's how we are. So you can't, the point about that is you can't just do everything in a vacuum. It can't be planned one city at a time. It can't be planned one federal entity at a time. And the federal entities can't worry about taking care of themselves, because if they wall off the base and turn it into an island, then no one can get there. Most of the people live in other places. So I'd like to talk a little bit, and I'm going backwards, about the pilot project very quickly. We came up with some recommendations, some of which will be familiar. First and foremost, to set up a regional entity. There is precedent for this. The Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization is set up as a state government authorized organization to look just at transportation. We should do something like that just for sea level rise. It has bond issuing authority, it has taxation authority, and it has project planning oversight. This is good. What we looked at in the pilot project was, well, what other things should we use in addition to that to get the region started? And these are going to sound familiar to you because a lot of them have been done here, and we use that as a model. First, set standards. We do have some success there. The city of Norfolk just set a 3-foot, yes, 3-foot, first floor elevation in a new zoning ordinance. They had to fight off the Tidewater Builders Association and the Realtors Association to make this happen, but they were able to do it. They are the first city in the 17 cities to set that high of a freeboard, and also to develop a resilience, kind of a resilience quotient, which is basically a series of things that people who want to develop in a special flood hazard area have to meet, conditions they have to meet to be able to get a permit to develop there. This is all excellent, and it's a great example of ways to make progress, but Norfolk is 97% built out. So this is really going to be for houses that are tear downs or what remaining property is left that might be in a special flood hazard area. But it's the first shot across the bow, in military terms, in making a higher standard to try to keep things under control here with building in the waterfront. So set standards. Ensure you have a collaborative with the best engineering and science that you can get from local universities, and I would add at the statewide level. Ensure you have a data center. New Orleans has a terrific data center. I use this all the time as an example. We are making progress in Norfolk. We're going to get there. It's all late breaking news, but we don't know what we don't know. We have bits and pieces of it, but we don't have a whole entity collaborating it. And I would add, and don't let a university run it. Because if a university runs it, it's only going to be what they want to study. Let's see, what's next? Define and prioritize infrastructure that's critical and vulnerable. And by that, I don't mean the FEMA definition or the DHS definition, thank you, the 17 different categories, but what is the essence of the region? Norfolk has done some of this. They've done it with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation. They're one of the 100 resilient cities. The other cities have not done it. And if we don't do it collectively, we don't know what the dependencies and interdependencies are between what each of the cities considers vulnerable. I can tell you that when Virginia Beach does it, their average elevation is 5 feet above sea level. They're going to find, based on what was predicted for sea level rise for our region in 80 years, that there will not be much left of Virginia Beach. And so they're all going to be scrambling for where they're going to go, and where they're going to want to go is Norfolk. Well, Norfolk doesn't have any room for them. So we have to do this collaboratively so we can sort these things out. This particular project was looking at the Pretty Lake area, which is part Virginia Beach, part Norfolk, and has Little Creek Naval Base in the middle of it. And we did it in a dependency and interdependency mapping exercise as a part of the pilot project, working with the cities and the Navy. We found many areas where they had no idea they had shared interests or conflicting interests. And the people who needed to be having these conversations within the two cities and the military had never met. So after they met, now they meet all the time. What a concept. But how do we institutionalize those processes so that we don't have to wait for these people to happen to encounter each other and we can make it something that happens routinely? That's a big part of the challenge for us. But it's not just us, though. The challenge with national security and the things that exist in Hampton Roads that will impact our national security only impact within our country, but they also impact how we operate and how we project our national security interests globally. And just as a cue for that, I picked Cape Town because of what's happening there right now. The 16th of April, they cut off the taps. This is a first world city, also a 100 resilient cities city. And they're, thank you, going to be in kind of a pickle. And why are they in a pickle? Well, they have one way of getting water, and that's reservoirs. They don't purify and re-inject their water into their aquifer. They don't re-inject it into their reservoirs. It's just what comes out of the reservoir they drink, and when they're done with it, they dump it. And if it doesn't rain, you have this. This picture is a year old. by the way. The other picture is also Reuters, but it's much more recent. Lots of racial, social issues there, environmental justice issues, wealthy people predominantly white, less wealthy people predominantly black Africans. The white people are drilling wells and having water shipped in. Everybody else can't afford that. So we shall see what happens when they actually cut off the water for good, because I don't see anything changing between now and then. So kind of a case study in the challenges of civilizations, and what will happen over time if we don't start to make progress. I do have just some things to think about. Many of you have already talked about, either here or in other panels, so we can kind of leave some of that to the questioning. And we can also talk a little bit about some things that are progress. There have been, I would say one challenge is how do the federal facilities, and I'll just throw this one out, how do we collaborate with federal facilities directly at the city level? Right now there was no real direct way to do that. There's no way to have shared projects. There's no way for the city of Norfolk and the Navy, as an example, to collaborate on a road that is submerged and a repeat flooder that prevents people from getting to the base. In a direct way right now. There's no way to do that. If Norfolk wants to fix the road, that's great, but there's no way that the Navy can help Norfolk fix that road. So what kind of legislation do we need to put in place to facilitate more federal, state, and local collaboration of funding, just as one example of things that we can talk about. So thank you very much for your time. And I mean, New Orleans is a leader in this area. We're following what you're doing very closely. And we hope to continue learning from you and learning, perhaps having the opportunity to share some things we're learning so that we as a nation don't learn by the hard way and get ourselves jammed into things that then get us into a dead-end situation where we have to completely stop what we've done and start over in a different way. So thank you very much.
All right, we've got a couple minutes for questions. Maybe the panelists can swing your chairs around here. And because it's a legal talk, I was asked to just kind of put some of this into a little bit of legal perspective. How many law students do we have in here? Okay, and then I know there's some existing lawyers in here. So obviously a lot of what we do is issue spotting and pulling things out. And clearly this talk is very geared towards the policy. But all you have to do is barely scratch the surface, and you can see all the legal complications and implications that exist in this. If anybody's read the master plan, which I'm sure a lot of you have, for the first time in the history of state Louisiana master plans, we have what's called non-structural protection. What is non-structural protection? It's all of these things that they've been talking about. One of those in particular is what's called voluntary acquisitions. Roughly 2,400 homes in these big swaths of land across coastal Louisiana are going to be available, if there's ever any money, to be voluntarily bought out. It's been done on Staten Island. It's been done in other places, small scale. We're not talking about, just Ile-de-Jean-Charles. We're talking about areas in Slidell. We're talking about areas just right outside of the flood protection system. Some legal questions that come up is, who decides? How do you decide? What if you don't provide protection for a community? Let's say that the flood wall that's in the middle of Plaquemines Parish cuts off South Plaquemines Parish. Are there arguments for a regulatory taking, and the failure to protect there? The Rear Admiral talked about the Dillon Rule, and the Dillon Rule is, the cutoff between I guess, Commonwealth and city governments and local governments. In Louisiana, we're a home rule charter state in a lot of areas, and if the home rule charter, like New Orleans did, predated the 1974 Constitution, that home rule charter has a whole lot of authority. So the local governments are actually quite empowered. And in fact, if you look at the voluntary acquisition, if you go to the master plan and look at Appendix E, it talks about the process that will be laid out. And it requires the parish governments to get involved. It requires the parish governments to participate and volunteer for these phased-in acquisitions. Now, if you know anything about Louisiana tax law, you also know that the parishes have the tax assessors, which receive the property taxes. So there's some particular, some possible complications there with these acquisitions and these buyouts. A couple other just quick kind of bullet point legal issues that are, related here. Talk about protecting critical infrastructure. We don't have a lot of naval bases. We have places that build Coast Guard ships. We have places that build naval ships. We do have a naval air station that's particularly vulnerable. But we have a whole lot of critical infrastructure, whether that be port infrastructure, whether that be The big bad oil and gas infrastructure, we can see what happened in Houston in just a little bitty rainstorm. It was a massive rainstorm. But the Arkema plant, okay, the Arkema plant that was built in a floodplain, as a lot of that area is, and a lot of our area is, and then flooded and exploded, and you have all those problems. We have a lot of critical infrastructure, chemical infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure, built within floodplains, and if it wasn't 15 years ago, it may be 15 years from now. So there's a lot of legal, hurdles that we have not begun to jump through and begun to navigate with where we have sited facilities in Louisiana. It's a huge issue. It's one that I don't, and I happen to be in the private sector now and represent companies, and it's one they're not thinking about. So that's another piece of this. I think there's a lot of other ones that you can pull out. I could go on for hours, but I'm going to let y'all get questions to the panelists. If y'all don't have any, I'll ask them. So, who has any questions?
On this relocation point, I guess I find your presentation highly aspirational, right? Is that we want to talk to all the communities, we want to get everybody involved, and I guess when I've actually been involved in efforts to do that, what we find is some people in the community are too busy to get involved. So a lot of them have different views on things, and nobody really wants to be really talking to the outsiders that are coming in anyway, because they're sort of suspicious about agendas and so forth. So can you give some how-tos on, or maybe examples of where these principles are being used and worked?
Yes, the communities that we're working with have actually asked us to help them with thinking through the process and help resource. And for a lot of the communities want to know what other communities are thinking. And so, for example, we have some of our the communities that we're working with linked with communities that are in the Pacific, in Alaska, and Africa, other places in the United States, continental United States, so that they can share ideas, so that when they're making choices to decide either to resettle or adapt in other kinds of ways, they are actually doing that from an informed decision. I think it's presumptuous to come in and just say, well, we need to have a discussion on resettlement or something else, with the community not having the knowledge or the ability to have engaged in conversations with other communities that are going through something similar. And so I think that's the first place, is that awareness education of having that kind of discourse. Shirley, do you want to say anything more on that?
We have no disagreement with you that it's a slow process. Just for the reasons you said, people have lives and they're busy. But you can do it. You have to listen and know the pace. And I would argue that with the frightening possible future that we have, people are going to start paying more attention. They're not going to have their head in the sand, as Howard Cunninger's list of avoidance issues. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a different, and how we respond to that different situation will also be a lesson for Norfolk and vice versa. How do we get people's attention?
The only thing I wanted to add real quick to that is, as Shirley said, people are beginning to see the future, and it's because they're experiencing it already, right? I mean, places like Lafitte, 30 years ago, highway flooding was an incredibly rare event. Now it's a monthly event. So, but the other thing I would add is, until there's money, when there's money, then people are going to start having a conversation, and we're not there yet, unfortunately.
I live over on the North Shore of St. Tammany, and I'm wondering, how do we, as citizens, when our parish government makes really poor decisions to allow development in floodplains, and the LA Safe did a lot of meetings over there, and they're talking about how many thousands of people are going to be moving to the North Shore to basically evacuate south, and they're trying to undo scenic river protection so that people can go in and build in floodplains, which just mean more flooding in the future. And their planning and zoning is trying to change the definition of elevated to mean fill, not elevated, but fill. That's in January. They proposed that's what they're planning to do. So how do you fight a parish government that's doing everything wrong?
You attend as many meetings as you possibly can.
So I'll use Virginia Beach as an example here. When we worked on the pilot project, Virginia Beach, the city of Virginia Beach, was right next to Norfolk. That's the other thing, it's a big joke about Hampton Roads. They act like they're independent. You can't tell one city from the next. They're all right up against each other. They're all the same. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, I've only lived there 10 years, so I'm not from there. So my opinion doesn't count. But
Doesn't count here either.
I know. The city of Virginia Beach, 475,000 people. They produce nothing. They are a tourism-based place and a bedroom community for the city of Norfolk. That's the honest truth. They lots of nice homes and all, but they would not let us use a sea level rise scenario curve in the pilot project that was higher than 3 feet by 2100, or at all, ever. Because they hadn't told their citizens to expect anything more than that, and they really didn't know what to say to them, which is a bunch of baloney. Again, General Honore would use another word. So then we have Matthew. And in the southern part of Virginia Beach, they had $1 million homes with water in them. Why? Because they were built in a floodplain that was once a strawberry field, an alluvial plain. That's the reason the strawberries grew well there. Those people got mad. And they got even more mad when the city manager made the comment about, well, I don't have to go out to sites. That's what the emergency managers do, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so suddenly you had all those people, and in addition to the communities that traditionally flooded, which are typically less wealthy and so less listened to, you had all those people together standing on the desks of the city council demanding action. So now, Virginia Beach has suddenly raised their high limit to at least 5 feet, and they've commissioned a $4 million study to look at stormwater solutions, which is excellent, excellent work, but it's only looking at stormwater. It's not looking at any of their other problems, and it's not giving them a vision for their future. But it is looking at something. It is doing something, and they've also passed they've committed to funding the repairs that are needed to the tune of probably almost $500 million. That's a little bit higher than they say, or $350 million is what they're expecting, but it's going to get higher. But it's over 15 years. So by the time we raise all that money 15 years from now, the set of solutions they're going to need are going to be completely different. The good news, though, is they will now talk about sea level rise. They will now accept that they're going to have more water than they were originally going to admit, and they are doing something. And this all took place in a year, and it's all because people started screaming. So I guess I would say keep organizing, don't give up, and to General Honore's point, get 250 people at the city council meetings and start asking some hard questions in a polite way. I mean, you don't, but you got to be there and let your voice be heard. It will make a difference. We're starting to see more discussion of it in the General Assembly in the state of Virginia. We do have a dichotomy. The western part of the state still thinks coal's coming back. So they don't want to talk about anything other than that, and there is a conflict there, and typically Hampton Roads is discounted in any kind of advancement or expansion of spending conversation. But there's more conversation about it this year than there has been in the past, and in the General Assembly, and I think that's a good sign. So it's starting to make a difference.
I've got one point to add to that, too. Just on the legal side, there's a case called the Eschete case, E-S-C-H-E-T-E, versus the city of New Orleans. And Jim Wilkins at Louisiana Sea Grant wrote a great law review article for the Florida State Law Review. And what the Eschete case stands for is that there can be liability on the part of the city or the parish government for allowing development in known floodplains. And so it's a case that has been all but ignored. But it has, I think, sweeping implications for city planners and city governments who, 30 years ago when they did not have the data, no big deal. Now the entire coastal zone of Louisiana is mapped with LIDAR and flood, with slosh models and everything, allowing folks to build in places that they shouldn't, and they know they shouldn't. I would look at the Eschete case.
Thank you. Yes. Because they're refusing to accept.
Is there somebody over here?
Yeah, I also live in St. Tammany Parish, but I live at 157 feet above sea level, and we bought there before Katrina. And we've seen a tremendous amount with the flooding to our west of apex predators and other animals moving with water flow displacement. tons more coyotes, wild feral hogs, big cats, huge big cats. So it's changed the community in regards to protecting animals and et cetera. I was interested in hearing what you said about making room for displacement of wildlife, because I think it's an issue that isn't often discussed. I don't think that they want to build on a floodplain necessarily. I think that they're more interested in industry in that region, in terms of what might go there, because if they displace people, then they're displaced no matter what. But could you talk a little bit more about calling attention to those less or disenfranchised creatures that, you know, also need assistance, and also the people who have to then live amongst them? I'm afraid to report when I see big predators, because I don't want people with guns in my yard, especially if I'm not home. And the last time I reported a large animal, someone came and put fish chum down the road. So I'm very hesitant to do that. Everybody in the neighborhood knows to tell each other, but they move through, they don't stay. So the neighborhood associations are the only thing that really talk about it, but then, you know, again, when you have a large animal, that attracts people who want to kill it.
There's a fellow by the name of Kyle White, K-Y-L-E, W-H-Y-T-E, Michigan State University, that has been writing along with his students on climate change, and they've been talking about the migrating maples, right to the point that our flora, fauna, and animals are going to be migrating. And to look at creative ways in which of doing that, as far as green areas, different types of parks, green belts. We've done different things in the past with green areas, and now we need to start thinking about that creatively instead of building out like the eastern shore of the United States, where it's just one gigantic, sprawl mall, to where we have open green areas, so that it allows that to happen. And again, we need to start thinking creatively and start doing it right away.
Well, because they're talking also about that recreational lake up in Madison, Jackson area, which will then stop the flow of water down the West Pearl. And if that happens, what happens to all the wildlife on the West Pearl? Will they come west towards us, or will they go east? So, I mean, that's an interstate issue, but, you know, again, that's not just going to a council meeting, that's an interstate issue.
Correct.
One more question. We got about 2 minutes, and the panelists will be down here after. If y'all want to grab.
I was just wondering if in Virginia, if there were like coastal wetlands type things. I know in southern Louisiana, like the wetlands are like critical to absorbing some of the surge coming in, or absorbing the floods. So does Virginia have like natural wetlands?
So we don't have the river delta issue. We don't have, all of our rivers are tidal estuaries. So they are rivers, but if they transition to being tidal as they get to where we are. So like the James River has a tremendous volume of water coming out of it, which merges with the Elizabeth, which goes through into the Chesapeake Bay right at Norfolk. So that's Chesapeake Bay, or the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel crosses right there. So we don't have we do have tremendous tidal marshes, but we don't have the riverine kind of marsh that you have. One of the challenges is the sea level is rising so fast that the marshes cannot migrate. So trees are dying out, it just collapses, and then you have erosion and you have a big mess. Or they don't have anywhere to migrate because it gets to people's property. And what we found in a lot of areas, especially the more built-out areas like Norfolk, is the places that we flood now repeatedly used to be marsh and used to be creek. They're filled, and the water's going to go where it always wanted to go, and it's going right back where it was. So unfortunately, some of that is right into downtown Norfolk and into communities, and it's different depending on where you are. If you're in Williamsburg, you don't have this problem. Parts of Virginia Beach don't seem to have much of it, but they will. But an awful lot of the area is extremely low. And so part of our challenge for what do we want to be in 80 years is we need to think about opening up space and turning, like the area I talked about in Norfolk and the Larchmont area. A small chunk of that was turned into wetlands, but all of those houses should be bought out, taken up, and that should all become wetlands, because that's what it is anyway. I mean, somebody lives there, but it's just wetlands. It's kind of ridiculous to do anything else. But boy, cities don't want to talk about that. Virginia Beach won't even mention it. They refuse to acknowledge we're going to have to do it. And Norfolk is because it's going to cost a fortune.
Yeah,
And how do we decide?
So
And then the environmental justice piece is huge there too. We have many underserved communities that are right on the water. And so who's standing up for them and what's the right answer there? And, you know, the rich people have choices. The others do not. And so Norfolk is really struggling with this even now. And they're not the only city. Portsmouth is mostly minority. Newport News 50-50, Hampton 50-50. All have water problems. And, you know, they're all beginning. The other thing I would say is good news is those mayors have finally started to talk. And we're starting to see the beginnings of some alliances with the political side coming together, which hasn't been before. That's in the 10 years that I've lived there, that has not been the case. So,
All right, well, everybody give a round of applause for the panelists.